so much for joining me today. We're going to be continuing our study of 1 Kings, and we're going to be looking at chapter 19. Let's pray as we get started. God, I thank you so much for today. I thank you that we get to open your word and that you speak to us through your word, God. I pray that as we read these words written so long ago about Elijah, that you will just speak to our hearts and move in power, God. We love you and pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So we have made it all the way to 1 Kings 19. So last week we left Elijah at the height of his prophetic career. We witnessed the contest on Mount Carmel and God displaying his power in awesome fashion. And at the end of that, Ahab participates in a covenant renewal meal, and then God sends the rain as they are headed down off the mountain. So when Elijah gets to the bottom of the mountain, that is where things begin to go wrong. And we see that right off the bat here in chapter 19. Now, before we dive in and start talking about it, I'm going to give you an idea of where we're going. So we're going to be spending most of our time together today in chapter 19, but I will hit some high points in the rest of 1 Kings, because next week we're going to be moving on ahead into 2 Kings and talking about some different stories there. So let's dive right in and look at 1 Kings 19. Now, Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. And what we know of Jezebel so far is she does not like the prophets of God, and she doesn't like Elijah. And so she responds exactly how we would expect her to, by sending a messenger to Elijah saying, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." So she sends him this threatening note that says, basically, "I am going to kill you." And so right here, we are continuing the story that we started last week and talking through chapter 17 and 18 and just continuing right on. And Jezebel is just responding to what happened on Mount Carmel with all of her fury, and she's completely irate. So Elijah responds just like any one of us probably would. He flees. It says here in the NIV that he was afraid and he ran for his life. And he ran far. So remember, they were in Mount Carmel and they came back down the mountain. And then he ran all the way to Beersheba, which is the most southern point in the kingdom of Judah. And that's where he stopped there, and he went, and then when he went a day's journey further into the wilderness of Beersheba, and he came under a broom tree and he sat down and he prayed, prayed that he might die, saying, "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." And then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. And I can't even begin to imagine how much stress and burden Elijah must have been feeling at this point. To come from such a pinnacle of watching God display his power and having the people respond and declare that the Lord is God, and seem to be wanting to return to to the covenant and to return to faithfulness. And Ahab to even be kind of insinuating that that's where he's headed to, and then to come back down the mountain and realize, no, not really. Seems like Jezebel's calling a lot of the shots, and what her opinion is the one that's going to go. And so everything is just completely crazy. And so Elijah, I can imagine Elijah just being completely spent. It would have taken a lot of just his mental focus, spiritual stamina, all of emotional stamina, physical stamina, just to be able to make it through the contest on Mount Carmel. I mean, I can't even begin to imagine how exhausted he must have been. But then God gave him all that extra energy, and he just ran down the mountain and was right with Ahab, or right in front of him the whole way. And then he runs for his life to Beersheba, and we're not told how long it has been. But he runs for his life. It wasn't just like a 5-minute run, running all the way to the southern point. and then going a day's journey forward. He left his servant in Beersheba and then went a day's journey further into the wilderness to just collapse and ask God to take him. I haven't experienced exhaustion quite to that extent, but I definitely have experienced burnout before, and it's real, and you feel pretty terrible, and you don't really want to do anything, and really just don't necessarily know which way to go. So here is Elijah in what I could only imagine being a really just completely spent moment. And so in the midst of him asking God to take his life, God responds by sending an angel who brings him food, wakes him up and says, get up and eat. And there's some bread and some water, and it has been baked over hot coals. And so he eats. So in the midst of him asking for death, God provides sustenance and life. And isn't that just like God? He is a life giver, and he wanted to take care of Elijah. He provides for that need in Elijah and sustains him. So Elijah eats, and then he lays down again. And then the angel of the Lord comes back a second time and says, get up and eat, for the journey is too much. And so he got up and he ate and drank. This time he gets all the way up and he doesn't go back to sleep. And it says, strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. Now, Horeb is the same thing as Mount Sinai. And it's called Mount Horeb some in Exodus and some in Deuteronomy, but it's also called Mount Sinai. So when you see Horeb, you can think Mount Sinai. So he goes all the way back to where things started for Israel, where they made their covenant promise with God. He goes all the way back there, all the way back to the place where Moses met God on the mountain. And it's really interesting as we read through this section, especially, to compare Elijah and Moses. And there's a lot of similarities, and we'll get to one here in just a minute. But just the fact that he's at Mount Sinai and you have this 40 days and 40 nights, and Moses was on the mountain for that length of time and met God there and dealt with the people who were unfaithful and kind of all over the map in a lot of ways, with how they were worshiping God or not worshiping God, or happy about the way things were going or not happy about the way things were going, angry at Moses, happy with him. I mean, and Moses' life was very stressful as well. So I imagine Elijah to feel a lot like Moses. So he goes to the place where he knows he can meet with God. And he went into a cave and he spent the night, as we learn in verse 9. So let's go ahead and read what happens while he's up on that mountain. And the word of the Lord came to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? And he replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. The Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? He replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. The Lord said to him, go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also, anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel-Maholah, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him. So here we have Elijah on the mountain, Mount Sinai, which is 200 miles from where he was in Beersheba. So no wonder it took him 40 days to get there. But he is here at the mountain, and he presents his case to God. God asks him, what are you doing here? And he presents his case to God. And he tells God exactly what he's thinking, exactly what his assessment of how things are going. The Israelites have rejected your covenant. So he goes back to the place where God made the covenant with the people of Israel, and informs God that they've rejected it. It says, they've torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, which we know he's not the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too, which that part's true as well. They definitely are trying to kill him, but he's not the only one left. Maybe the only one who was actively going toe-to-toe with Ahab and Jezebel at the moment. But we know that Obadiah hid some prophets in some caves. So what's going on here? How is Elijah feeling? One of the things I like about this scene is you have Elijah, the prophet of God, and he's having a really rough time in this last 40 days or plus, because it took him longer than just a day, right, to get there. So he is having a really rough time, and God meets with him here on this mountain. He meets with his prophet. The fact that Elijah's having a hard time and having to run for his life and flees down to Mount Sinai isn't good. It doesn't throw off God. He is right there to meet with his prophet. And we see God work with Jeremiah and help him whenever he is wanting to not be a prophet anymore. The same with Moses. Moses dealt with the people, and he didn't want to keep going forward. And we know Moses was reluctant in the beginning. And so God works and takes care of his prophets, even in the midst of the craziness that they are facing. And so he listens to Elijah's words, his assessment, his complaint, and he responds by telling Elijah, go and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, because the Lord is about to pass by. So God's response is his presence. Moses too meets with God on Mount Sinai. So if we flip over to Exodus 33, and we'll do that really quick so we can look at it. I love this passage. This is the passage in Exodus 33 where Moses is up on the mountain, and he asks the Lord if he wants to see the Lord's glory. And let's just read it. It's a short passage. So in Exodus 33, starting in verse 18. So Moses and God have been having a conversation, and this is the end of it here. And Moses says, now show me your glory. And the Lord said, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But, he said, you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live. Then the Lord said, there is a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen. So Moses met with God on the mountain, and Moses got to see God's back. And so here, Elijah meets with God on the mountain, and we have these natural phenomena with powerful wind that could tear the mountains apart. It's a really strong wind. And then you have this earthquake, and you have this fire that's just coming. And the Lord is not in any of those, but these natural phenomena are like announcing that God is coming. God's presence is near, it's coming. And then we get the gentle whisper, or utter silence. That's another way that some translations translate that. the sound of utter silence, the sound of a gentle whisper. And that is when Elijah covers his face with his cloak and goes out and stands at the mouth of the cave. So Elijah, despite all that he had been through and what brought him to Mount Sinai, he still knows God, and he knows what God's presence feels like and what it sounds like, and he's confident in that. And so he goes out, and God asks him again, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah repeats the same thing again. This time God gives Elijah an answer. And he sends him back. He says, "Go back to Damascus." And God says, "I hear what you're saying about the people of Israel and how they've rejected my covenant and how they are worshiping idols and they're killing my prophets. I'm hearing all of that." And he responds to this with 3 different tasks for Elijah to do. He tells him to anoint 3 different people, to anoint Hazael to be the king over Aram. So Hazael would have been a Gentile, so not a Jew. Jehu to be the king over Israel, and Elisha to succeed him as prophet. And so what essentially God is saying here is that these first 2 men, Hazael and Jehu, are going to be the ones who are going to take out Ahab and his family and bring God's judgment on them for their Baal worship and bringing all of the people of Israel along with that. And then Elisha is going to kind of finish the job. He's going to succeed Elijah as prophet. And how cool for Elijah to know that his own prophetic ministry is going to continue on through the ministry of Elisha. And their ministries are closely connected. And we'll see that as we get into 2 Kings and pick up more of Elisha's story. And then finally, God gives Elijah just a piece of really a hope, is how I hear it in verse 18, by saying, there are 7,000 in Israel who have never worshipped Baal, who have never bent their knee and worshipped. And what a promise for Elijah, because in the world that he was operating in, he is facing Ahab and Jezebel and constantly interacting with those who are worshiping Baal. So for him to be reminded that that doesn't represent every single person, that there are still people who are faithful to God, who are maintaining that covenant and worshiping God alone, is it had to have been such a balm and a comfort to Elijah in this moment, where I can imagine he just felt completely just pressed on every side. And so at this point, Elijah leaves Mount Sinai and he does what God has instructed him to do. And the end of chapter 19, we see Elisha being anointed by Elijah. And it's such a cool story. So I encourage you to read it. We're not going to really read it here. But one of the things that's interesting is that he doesn't anoint him with oil. He puts his cloak around him. And that's like the way he signifies that Elisha is going to succeed him. Elisha is going to serve under Elijah. We can think of their relationship kind of like Joshua serving under Moses and being trained and having this interconnected ministry. So once Moses died, Joshua picked things up and kept going in the same vein as Moses did. And Elisha will do that. And we will see that as we get into 2 Kings. And at the end of this, at chapter 19, we get more information about the kings again. It kind of jumps back into going back and forth about the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. And so the first thing we get is that the king of Aram goes to attack Samaria, and so meaning the people of Israel and Ahab. And so we get that story and about how Ahab defeats Ben-Hadad. So there is war between Aram and Samaria, and Ahab defeats him. But Ahab doesn't kill him as he was instructed. He lets him go instead and tries to make a treaty. This was against God's will. And this is then condemned by a prophet. And that's what happens in chapter 20. It's a very fascinating story. And then in 21, it's just a really sad story. And it's the story of Naboth's vineyard. So we're continuing to follow Ahab and Jezebel and all of this stuff that they do. And essentially, Ahab wanted this vineyard that belonged to Naboth. It was his inheritance. And Ahab wanted it to make a vegetable garden because it was close to his palace. And he tried to buy it from Naboth and he didn't want to sell. And so so basically Ahab goes home and pouts about it and sulks about it. So much so that his wife notices and says he laid on his bed sulking and refusing to eat. That's in verse 21, verse 4. So his wife Jezebel comes in and is like, what's going on? And he tells her, and she said, well, get up and eat. I'll get you the vineyard. And so she does exactly what you would think she would do. She basically has him killed, gets the people in the elders who lived in his city to stone him. She basically tricking him into coming and having people make false accusations. And then they take him out and they stone him. And so then she tells Ahab, go and take possession of the vineyard. And then Elijah shows back up because the word of the Lord came to Elijah. That's in verse 17. He says, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who rules in Samaria, and tells him about how he's in Naboth's vineyard. And then Elijah prophesies against the house of Ahab, saying, I'm going to bring, this is speaking for God, I'm going to bring disaster on you. I will wipe out your descendants and cut off from Ahab every last male in Israel, slave or free. I'll make your house like that of Jeroboam, son of Nabot, and that of Baasha, son of Ahijah, because you have aroused my anger and have caused Israel to sin. And they also condemned Jezebel, so the dogs will devour her by the wall of Jezreel. But then when Ahab hears this, he tears his clothes, he puts on sackcloth, and he fasted. And so the Lord comes to Elijah, and the word of the Lord comes to Elijah and says, have you noticed how Ahab has humbled himself before me? That's in verse 29. Because he has humbled himself, I will not bring this disaster in his day, but I'll bring it on his house in the days of his son. Then in chapter 22, the book of 1 Kings closes out with Ahab and King Jehoshaphat from Judah coming together to go to war against Aram. And Micaiah the prophet prophesies against this war, saying, don't go, this is not going to be good. Even though all of his fellow prophets were saying, hey, you should go. Micaiah was saying, no, you will not be victorious. He prophesies that Ahab's not going to survive this war, this battle. But Ahab throws Micaiah in prison and says, no, I'm going to do it anyways. And he is killed. He even goes to battle in disguise to try to prevent that from happening, but he is killed by just a random archer. He gets shot by an arrow and he dies. And he's succeeded by his son, Ahaziah. And so at this point in chapter 22, the story flips back to the kings of Judah, and we learn a little bit about Jehoshaphat, who followed in his father Asa's footsteps and was faithful. We learned that. He was faithful to the Lord. And then it flips back to Ahaziah, king of Israel, and that is where 1 Kings ends and 2 Kings picks up. And next week we will look at 2 Kings, and we'll start our conversation and journey through that part of the story. So I hope that this has been an interesting journey so far. I hope that also that you've been able to read all of 1 Kings and are getting ready to start reading all of 2 Kings, two very fascinating books and one continuous story. And I think that there's a lot we can learn, a lot we can think about and ponder in these two books. So I hope you'll join me again next week. Bye.